Well, good morning, church.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, it's Mother's Day, and I want you to know that this sermon does, in fact, have to do with mothers. I promise it does. I always prefer my preaching to involve mothers on Mother's Day. It's kind of a point of pride. I like a Mother's Day sermon that has to do with mom. However, this particular Mother's Day, in order to get to a sermon that involves mothers, I need to start, sort of, with some fathers. Now, in part, I need to start with fathers because the chapter of the Bible I'm preaching from starts with a father, or at least with a man who's going to be a father by the end of the chapter. We're in chapter 4 of the Old Testament book of Ruth, and it begins like this. Now, Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Boaz is the father-to-be in question that we're starting with today. And it's actually a little frustrating because this is the fourth and final sermon in a series from the book of Ruth, and every other chapter of Ruth except this one begins with a mom, at least with her being present. Chapter 1 begins in the days when the judges ruled. There was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And there she is, his wife. She's a mom, 2 sons. Now, as we've said before, it sounds like it's going to be a story about this Israelite man from the tribe of Judah and also his family. But you read the story, and by verse 3, he dies. And by verse 5, his sons die, and the only one left from verse 1 is the mom. Turns out, twist, it's her story. Who is she? Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. Now, of course, the book is called the book of Ruth, not the book of Naomi. And Ruth does come along into the story fairly quickly. It's also her story. She shows up in verse 4 just in time to marry one of the sons before he dies. Ruth, of course, is a native of Moab where they're living, a Moabite. But when the son whom she married dies, instead of going back to her Moabite family and her Moabite religion, Ruth sticks with Naomi and with the Israelite God of whom she had learned from this little Israelite family. And when Naomi decides to go back to Israel, bereft and impoverished and bitter, Ruth goes along to take care of her. And it's Ruth and Naomi, daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, against the world, trying to figure out how to survive. That's the story. And in fact, as I said, not only the first chapter, but every subsequent chapter, except chapter 4, where we're working from today, every subsequent chapter begins with Naomi. She's the focus. Chapter 2 says, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. That's how we're first introduced to our friend Boaz, in terms of being related to Naomi by marriage. And there's the whole story of how Ruth goes out to engage in gleaning, the social safety net of the very poor in Israel who were allowed, by Israelite law, Torah, to pick up the leavings from the harvest of those who had land and crops. And Ruth finds herself in the field of Boaz, and an attraction blossoms between them. And so Naomi then has an idea. She hatches a scheme. Because, as the verse there says, Boaz is from the clan of Elimelech. Hang on to that idea because it's going to be important. And accordingly, chapter 3 begins, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? There's Naomi, and she's there at the beginning of the chapter again. And what she's talking about is arranging a marriage. Naomi has decided to play matchmaker between Boaz and Ruth. Now, I should say again, as I've said in previous sermons in the series, that from our modern perspective, this is a very unconventional match, and perhaps to our modern sensibilities, distasteful. Because Boaz is old and Ruth is young. Boaz is rich and Ruth is poor. Not only that, but Boaz is a native Israelite, well established in the community. Ruth is a foreigner, no standing in the community. There's a huge power disparity between them. Nevertheless, the fact remains, Ruth is attracted to Boaz and he to her. But Boaz, because as the text says, he's a worthy man, gentlemen pay attention, Boaz isn't taking advantage of that power disparity. He's not making a move. In fact, the story implies that at least one of the reasons Boaz hasn't made a move is that he thought that Ruth would be more interested in someone more her own age. And so he hadn't entertained the idea that she might be interested in him. So Naomi basically helps Ruth know how to take her shot, which Ruth does. Now understand, from Naomi's point of view at least, this isn't just because she thinks they make a cute couple, although there may be some of that, because apparently they do. But from Naomi's point of view, a major part of why she's trying to arrange this marriage is that Boaz, because of his kinship to her dead husband Elimelech, Boaz stands in a special cultural relationship to Naomi and through her to Ruth, a relationship that the Bible calls Redeemer. The word is Redeemer. Now we, in a modern society, we don't have an exact cultural equivalent to that. We've been saying through this whole series that that's one of the important things to know when you study the book of Ruth. We're dealing with a culture, the culture of Bronze Age Palestine, that's very, very different from ours. They have customs and ideas that seem strange to us. And one of those ideas is this idea of the Redeemer. That's what Naomi says about Boaz to Ruth in chapter 2. The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And it's what Ruth then says to Boaz in chapter 3. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. That's what she says to him. And it might not sound like it to our 21st century ears, but that's Ruth proposing to Boaz, inviting him to marry her. And we talked at some length last week about what all that means. And by the way, if you missed that sermon, and you want to know more, it's available for you to watch on our church YouTube channel, or you can see it as part of last week's whole worship service on our Facebook page and Facebook Live. Or if you prefer to just listen, it's available as an MP3 on our church website. Just so many ways to access that sermon if you want to. And I don't have time to re-preach that whole sermon today. So for our purposes this morning, at this point anyhow, it's enough to know that a redeemer meant a male relative with the means to exercise certain justice-related economic and familial rights and responsibilities. I'll have more to say about that later in the sermon, but the point here is that one of the things being a redeemer meant is that as a redeemer, Boaz has both the right and the responsibility to marry Ruth. Now, as I said, the story implies that one of the reasons he hasn't already moved in that direction is he hadn't thought she would be interested. Now he knows she is. But additionally, as is tradition in any great romance story, it turns out there's a hitch in this match that Naomi has hatched. If you remember from last week's sermon, Boaz says to Ruth, "It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." And this is why I was saying I have to start with fathers. Because to understand what Boaz means, we have to understand the rules of patrilineal inheritance, which is a fancy way of saying how power and wealth and status and identity are passed down from father to son. Israelite culture at the time was a patrilineal culture. It all began with the man Israel and his 12 sons, the patriarchs. You'll remember all of this perhaps from the book of Genesis. And each of the patriarchs gives rise to a tribe, the 12 tribes of Israel. And I should say, I know all of this can be kind of tedious to the 21st century American. We don't like the genealogies in our Bible. In fact, if you ever tried to read the Bible all the way straight through, all the genealogies with all the strange sounding names can be a real barrier to getting anywhere. And by the way, if that's you, rejoice. The Apostle Paul is on your side about this. Genealogies are on his list. Things to avoid. Paul says in his letter to his friend Titus, avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. And ordinarily, spending too much time focused on the genealogies is unprofitable and worthless. But the thing is, in order for the book of Ruth to make sense to us, we're going to have to pay at least a little bit of attention to this particular genealogy, because it comes in here. It's essential to understanding the story. So now everything in the book of Ruth takes place within the context of the tribe of Judah. That's important to know. Remember, that's how the story began. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. And everybody in the story, except for Ruth, is a Judahite, tribe of Judah. But now the next thing to know is that every tribe was subdivided into what were called clans. The Bible says clans, depending in large part on how many sons the patriarch had. Judah had 3 sons, Shelah by his first wife, and then also Perez and Zerah, who were twins. And Perez ends up being Judah's heir because of shenanigans on the part of his mother Tamar, who was a Canaanite, a Gentile. And maybe you remember that story from Genesis also. Tamar chased Judah, and he didn't run quite as fast as he might have. That's going to be a little important to our story today also, but the upshot is that the clan of Perez ended up being the most prestigious clan, the clan from which the tribal rulers of Judah came. And you have to picture everything that happens in the book of Ruth as happening within the context of the clan of Perez. And when the story says, as you'll remember, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz, that's what it's talking about. They're from the same clan. Clan of Perez of the tribe of Judah. And in fact, our chapter of Ruth today closes with a description of the important genealogy in question. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz. That's how we get to Boaz. Now, a problem we have is that nowhere are we told how we get to Naomi's husband Elimelech. So we have to kind of speculate. And I will just tell you that some of what follows here is speculation. Rank speculation. Because I had to kind of sit down and work it out for myself because I'm that nerd. And also, I should say that the situation may actually be more complex than this, but it is certainly not less. This is the simplest version I could come up with. So we need to start at the level of Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon, who fathered Salmon, who fathered Boaz. That's what the text says. But what we have to picture is that Amminadab has another son, a younger brother to Nahshon. Now, we don't know his name. He doesn't come into the story. He's just some guy. So let's call him God. There he is. We have to assume him, and we have to assume that he has at least a couple of sons of his own. We'll call them Bob and Larry, because that's about my maturity level. Now, again, these aren't people who are mentioned in the text, but we have to figure, for the sake of the story, that they existed. And then we have to picture that Elimelech is the son of Bob. Now, was he really? I don't know. But we have to picture it. And there you have Boaz being Elimelech's near relative, as the text says. Specifically, Boaz is Elimelech's second cousin. Let's put that there. Again, it's possibly more complex than this, but not likely to be simpler. And Elimelech married Naomi, and they had their son Mahlon, who married Ruth. And then remember, Boaz said, there's a redeemer nearer than I. We have to picture that Larry also has a son. He's just sort of there to fill in the spot, so let's call him Phil. And then he has a son who is also Elimelech's near kin. So let's call him Ken. Why not? But if we're paying attention, you'll notice that that makes Ken Elimelech's first cousin once removed, which is nearer than second cousin. Now again, it may actually be more complicated than this, but it's certainly not any less complicated than this. Is everyone tracking with me so far? So this kinsman, whose name we never get, he has what we might call the right of first refusal. Boaz can't marry Ruth unless and until this person says he's not interested. Now the question we might ask is, why hasn't this fellow stepped up and done his job as redeemer? And apparently it's just a matter of he didn't care. So Boaz is going to have to figure out how to make him care. And now we actually get to hear the rest of the story. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. Now, by the way, when it says that he sat down at the gate, you have to picture that the gate of the city is where people did what we might call official business. It's almost like what we would think of as going down to the courthouse. Boaz says to his kinsman, "I have some official business to conduct with you." And he would have understood that, especially because it says next, "And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down." These guys are going to act as official witnesses of the proceedings. And then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." Now again, we have to remember that there are cultural customs at work here that are a bit odd to us, because otherwise we have to wonder, if Naomi had a parcel of land that she could sell, why hasn't she been using it to grow crops? Why was Ruth having to go out and glean like somebody with no land? And what we have to picture is that when Elimelech and Naomi and their sons had gone away to Moab because of the famine, they had temporarily sold their land. Temporary sale was a thing you could do back then, because the understanding that the Israelites had was that land didn't belong to individuals, it belonged to families. And so what you were really selling wasn't the land. It was the number of harvests to the next Jubilee year. The Jubilee happened once every 50 years. And at the Jubilee, the land would revert back to the original owner or his heirs. And so what we have to picture, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, is that somebody else has been farming that land. And that's part of the bitterness of Naomi, because she could see that land every day, but she couldn't use it, and someone else was. But the idea is that now Naomi is intending to sell that land, not temporarily, but permanently, probably to the person who's now farming it. And the reason that she would do that, what that signifies, is that she's out of hope. Her husband is dead, her sons are dead, she's too old to have children, there's no family for that land to revert to, so she's going to sell it permanently and it will pass out of the family. And part of the job of the Redeemer was, in such circumstances, to buy the land back so that it wouldn't pass out of the family. All of this is in the Torah. You can read all about it, Leviticus chapter 25. And what's clever here is that Boaz is presenting this as a purely business opportunity. An opportunity for this kinsman to increase his land holdings. Boaz said, "So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." And you just have to notice how casual this person is about all of this. I mean, this is life and death to Naomi. This is her dead husband and her dead sons and the reality that they are never coming back. This is the end of the line. This is poverty and sorrow and grief. But to this guy, it's just, oh, well, sure, I'll buy it. Another day, another dollar, am I right? Another parcel of land. What's a little land, more or less, among relatives? This is that guy's attitude. Naomi is over there running on fumes, sending her Moabite daughter out to glean, and this guy is their nearest redeemer. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Now again, we talked about this at some length already in this series. What's at issue is a custom, a very odd custom to us, called levirate marriage. And the idea is that part of the job of the Redeemer is to take as a wife, even if he already has wives of his own, because remember, in this society, plural wives is a thing, to take the wife of the dead and try to give her a child who would count as the heir of the dead man. And all of this is in Torah too, and you can go read all about it. Deuteronomy 25. Make a note if that's something that interests you. So Boaz has kind of sprung this on his kinsman here. There's not just the land, there's the girl. And why did he do it like that? Because he knew what his kinsman would say. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, what's he talking about? Remember how I said we have to understand the rules of patrilineal inheritance, how power and wealth and status and identity are passed down from father to son. See, as long as Elimelech and Mahlon are dead and have no heir, then all the power and wealth and status belonging to the family of this guy right here go directly to our buddy Ken there. However, if he marries Ruth in a levirate marriage, the moment he gives her a child, all that power and wealth and status, including whatever land he's inherited, all go through Naomi and Ruth to that child. That child becomes the head of the family instead of the kinsman in question. So he says, nope, don't want that to happen. That looks like a problem for you, Boaz. So the story says, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Now that seems weird to us. In order to ratify some sort of contract, you give someone your shoe. What's going on there? Well, it's complicated because there's a lot of unspoken nuance and symbolism. But what it amounts to is in that culture at that time, a shoe was a symbol of power. Wearing shoes was, we might say, a power move. That's why, for instance, if you'll remember when Moses came before God at the burning bush in the book of Exodus, what did God say? Take off your shoes. You don't get to be the one with the power. You get to be the one who's humble. And especially when it came to land, the shoe had symbolic power. Because what you put your foot on, you own. It was part of a transaction. If you bought land, you would go to survey it, look it over, and that's the official sale. But then you would go walk the property, and it was yours. Every place you set the sole of your foot. So by handing over his sandal like this, the kinsman was saying, I'm handing over to you the right to walk the land. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Notice that about the house of Perez. Remember how I said that everything that happens in this story is within the clan of Perez? And notice that next bit too, because it's like they're remembering. They're remembering their story. They're remembering the story of Tamar, who risked everything to have a portion among the people of God and to bear an heir to the house of Judah, even though she was a Gentile. That's their heritage. And what they're noticing is that that's Ruth's story too. Risking everything, laying it all on the line to have a portion among the people of God and to bear an heir to Judah as well. That's Ruth's story. The story that Gentiles can have a place among God's people. The story that God has a place in his story for them. Which makes it our story. That Gentiles can have a place among God's people. That God has a place in his story for you. And here comes the happily ever after. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Now I'm just going to say, I'm telling you all of this because I want you to have a good Mother's Day. Because remember, Naomi starts out the story having everything she thought she had taken away from her. She is broken and bereft and bitter. In fact, that was the story she was telling herself, if you'll remember. The name Naomi in Hebrew means sweet or beautiful. And Naomi says, "Don't call me that anymore." And she wants to change her name to Mara, which means bitter. She was mad at life and mad at God. That was her story. But God had a different story in mind for her. And this is how the story ends. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." You know, I'm going to say what I've been saying all along. I'm so thankful that the Bible tells us stories about characters who we can love and identify with, who are bitter, who are mad at life and mad at God. Because sometimes that's us. Do I hear a whispered amen? But God had a redeemer for Naomi, because that's who God is. And the women go on to say, "He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." And I love the commendation of Ruth there. Your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. But here's the interesting thing. This is the moment when Ruth leaves the story. And it's all about Naomi again, just like it was at the beginning. As it began, so it ends. The spotlight falls squarely on Naomi. And this is her moment. The woman who had had sons and husband ripped from her with no hope of restoration is restored. And it's a little hard, I know, because on the one hand, her husband and her sons are still dead. pregnant. She's holding a baby she never thought she'd get to hold. And through the faithfulness of Ruth and the kindness of Boaz and the hope that Naomi herself was able to have because of them, there's redemption. Because that's how redemption always comes into the world, through faithfulness and kindness and hope. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. If you're playing along at home, that's King David to you and me. And as the ancestor of David, he's the ancestor of Jesus, which is how we get to where we are. Now, it's very sweet and maybe a little weird to us that the people of the neighborhood give him a name. Obed appears then in the character almost of a nickname. It means serving, because it's like he's serving as her son. And the sound of it, Obed, borrows sounds from the three Hebrew words that mean a son has been born to Naomi. Yalad ben Naomi. The O from Naomi, the Be from Ben, and the D from Yalad, Obed. And that's the story. But I want to go back for just a moment to that verse when the women started talking. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel." And again today we have some small cards that we want to give you to take home with you. There are little stands back there on the back if you don't already have those. One of those little wooden ones, little metal ones that you can pick up. And what we'd like for you to do is to take one of these cards. Take one per household, at most two, because we don't have an unlimited supply. We want to share them around. But what we'd like to do is invite you to take these cards home with you and put them somewhere where you can see them, so that you can meditate on them during the week. And if you use social media, we'd love to invite you to post a picture of the card where you put it, and let people know what we're doing at our church. Invite them to be a part of it. Use the hashtag #SecondTake. It's kind of a joke. And also, by the way, if you're watching online, you live locally, you can contact me, make arrangements to stop by the church building and pick up one of those cards during the week. We'd love for you to do that. But our hope is maybe that you'll come to memorize the verse in question as you meditate on it through the week. And right now, I'd like you to say those words along with me. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." May his name be renowned in Israel is a fancy way of saying, you got to tell somebody. The word's got to get out about what a good redeemer. Let me tell you something. God has not left you without a redeemer. And if that's true, if God has not left you without a redeemer, then you got to make his name known. Back there on the back table, you'll also see some of these cards. I'm pretty pleased with how they turned out. And what I want to invite you to do is use these as an invitation. You can hand them out to your friends. Just take 5 or 6 of them. You can leave them at a restaurant if you're leaving a good tip. Don't leave a bad tip and leave one of those. But you can leave them places where people might pick them up. You can hand them out to people that you meet. We'd love to invite you to do that. Please do. Please take one of these cards, some of these cards, and hand them out to people who you think might need a redeemer. It's a way to make his name known. And as you do it, I just want you to think. Maybe say a prayer. Blessed be the Lord who has not left me this day without a redeemer. Help me to make his name known.